I'm CIndyMalone from the English department here at St. John's and St. Ben's. During my sabbatical in 2011, I spent several months reading and writing about an 18th century novel titled The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. It was written by Laurence Sterne, an Anglican clergyman whose interests wandered far, far away from pulpit and parish. Laurence published Tristram Shandy serially. The first 2 volumes appeared in 1759, and they caused a sensation in Britain and in Europe more generally. Tristram Shandy is still loved and read, especially by fans of experimental fiction. While I was writing about Tristram Shandy, I also created a one-of-a-kind, handmade version of Volume 1. I'll be talking about some of the features of that project. I'd like to pause in order to thank Rachel Mellis, my colleague in the art department, for taking the good photographs. I'm responsible for the not-so-good photographs. We'll start with the closed book. I call this project the Earnest Reader's Edition of Tristram Shandy. The narrator, Tristram, invites the reader into a lively conversation. He scolds us, exhorts us, hectors us, and even sends us back to reread chapters we didn't read well enough to suit him. Tristram purports to tell the story of his life, but he recounts his life story in little fragments, out of sequence, separated by long digressions about whatever happens to be on his mind. When this book is closed, it looks pretty much like any other closed book. The only hint of something odd is the spine. The book is literally buttoned together. If you unbuttoned the spine, you could make the entire book collapse into a pile of pages, my way of signaling that you're about to read a book that just barely hangs together. As you read this version, you encounter many more buttons and inserts. I chose buttons because jokes about buttons and buttonholes run throughout the novel. If you want to trace the life of Tristram Shandy, you have to take the book apart and assemble a chronological version of the scrambled narrative. Tristram Shandy jumps backwards and forwards in time, bedeviling the reader who wants to pin down the chronology. It's also full of digressions, which Tristram sees as a virtue. Digressions, he says, incontestably are the sunshine. They are the life, the soul of reading. Take them out of this book, for instance, you might as well take the book along with them. He digresses so many times in so many directions that he doesn't even get around to recounting the story of his birth until Volume 4. So the earnest reader has to put aside the digressions and assemble a coherent narrative, only to realize that this enterprise calls into question our assumptions about narrative coherence and about the form of books. I've aimed to show in the physical form of the book the cognitive work we do as we read, trying to make sense of Sterne's brilliant and exasperating novel. That's one aim of the book. I also want to highlight the cognitive work involved in reading any book, the ways of thinking we engage in without even noticing that we're piecing together bits in order to create coherence. One of the many unusual features of Sterne's novel, when it was first published, was a page of marbled paper. Tristram says, "Read, read, read, my unlearned reader. Read, or I tell you beforehand, you had better throw down the book at once, for without much reading you will not be able to penetrate the moral of the next marbled page, motley emblem of my work." The marbled page served as a motley emblem of Sterne's work because this kind of marbling, called the stone pattern, involves dropping colors onto thickened water and then laying a piece of paper on the surface of the water. When it's lifted away, the stone pattern appears. The stone pattern of Sterne's page features several colors, and each of the marbled pages would have differed from all the others. I marbled papers for the end papers by way of signaling that this book is a motley assemblage of parts. Throughout the book, I've used the odd features of the first edition, like this marbled page, as elements of my earnest reader's edition. When we begin the novel, we expect to hear about the beginning of Tristram's life, and we do, but not about his birth. As I said, we don't get to that until Volume 4. Tristram begins with the moment of conception, an event that he understandably regards as momentous. But that moment went awry, in his view, when his mother interrupted his father at a delicate moment in their sexual congress. She suddenly piped up and asked his father if he had remembered to wind the clock. The conception scene is the first passage of the life story. An earnest reader would want to mark that important event. This critical moment is buttoned into the book. The reader can remove it from the book and button it onto a long, long ribbon bookmark with buttons sewn onto it. Since the chronology of the life story is all mixed up, the earnest reader can take out each moment in the life story and button it onto the ribbon in chronological order. When we think about when something happens in a book, we think about it in two ways. That happened in March 1718. That happened on page 2. We're always attending to two temporalities, the timeline of the narrative and the structure of the book. I printed each removable passage in gray on the page of the book, and then I printed it in black and buttoned it into the book over the gray passage. That way, when you remove a passage and button it into its chronological place on the bookmark, the ghostly version of that passage remains on the page. On the back of each buttoned-in passage of Tristram's life story, I wrote the date on which the event would have happened and the page number. That marks the two temporalities. It also allows you to assemble the timeline on the bookmark and then reassemble the book. At some points in the novel, Tristram offers two paths. If you're interested in the next bit, he says, read on. If you're not, he says, skip ahead. When he wants to tell a fuller version of the conception story, for example, he offers those options. To those who want to hear that whole story, he commands, shut the door. In this version, only when you shut the door can you read what lies behind it. At another point in Volume 1, Tristram is terribly disappointed in his reader. He doesn't think Madame read Chapter 19 closely enough. Go back and reread Chapter 19, he directs her. We're in Chapter 20 by now, but I've double-printed Chapter 19 and sewn it inside Chapter 20, so that the reader must follow Tristram's instructions. The most famous peculiar page in all 9 volumes of Tristram Shandy appears in Volume 1, Chapter 12, The Black Page. In order to get to the story of his birth, Tristram has felt the need to explain why he wasn't born in London as his older brother was, why his birth was attended by a midwife, how that woman came to be a midwife, and who paid for her midwife license. The answer to that last question is Parson Yorick, whose story Tristram spreads over multiple chapters. That story ends with Yorick's death, with the words, "Alas, poor Yorick." The famous black page follows, marking Tristram's mourning for Yorick. The black page in the first edition wasn't entirely black because achieving a solid black rectangle using letterpress would require sending the page through the press several times. It was a mottled black. I chose to use black paper lace because Tristram makes much of Parson Yorick's saddle, edged with black lace, and because the cuffs of gentlemen's mourning clothes were often edged in black lace. You can remove the Yorick story and see the gray version of the black page. As the novel goes along, Tristram sticks in another form of digression, documents he believes we need to read in order to understand his story fully. He roots around among his papers and finds his parents' marriage settlement, important because this document explains why Tristram was born at Shandy Hall instead of in London. The facts in the case are these. Elizabeth Shandy has the right to give birth in London, where respected medical attendance is available. If, however, she incurs the expense of going to London to give birth and turns out to be mistaken about her pregnancy, so there is no baby to deliver, she forfeits the right to give birth in London the next time she's pregnant. In that case, she will have to give birth at home at Shandy Hall. That's precisely what happens in Tristram's story. His mother went to London, mistakenly believing she was pregnant, so she must give birth to Tristram at Shandy Hall. That's why we need to know about the midwife, and why we need to know how she became a midwife, and why we need to know the story of Parson Yorick, who paid for the license that allowed her to become a midwife, and so on, and so on, and so on. Tristram also includes correspondence between doctors of the Sorbonne on the question of how to proceed if an unborn infant of Catholic parents needs to be baptized. Their lengthy deliberations in French conclude with a solution. Just in case you need to tuck away that solution in your own mind for an emergency, it involves a squirt. The Earnest Reader's Edition includes other features, but perhaps these glimpses will give you a sense of the project. Thanks.